stand and sing on the first verse, 516. We're marching to Zion. Sing together. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus surround the throne. And thus surround the throne. We're marching to Zion. Beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upwards to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. While my wife plays, turn around, fellowship, shake hands with those around you. On the last verse, then let our songs abound. Then let our songs abound and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. There were worlds on high, there were worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upwards to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Man, that's a lot of words to spit out at 10 o'clock in the morning, isn't it? But we are marching to Zion. We're going to heaven one day. Brother Tim?
You may be seated. That is a lot of words to say that early in the morning. All right, before we go any farther, Sunday school this morning for this class. Did anybody bring visitors with you this morning? Oh, we're failures. All right, cool. One Bible? All right, let's see. Based on the number, you all get like 2 books. I mean, somebody's going to get really gypped when it comes to 3 John and Obadiah, so, all right. Mr. Simmons, can you go ahead and cut that audio for me? Let me know when you're ready. We're cut. I just didn't want him to hear that. Sometimes he tunes into live stream, and we're trying to make this a surprise. So, all right, Daniel chapter 6 in your Bibles. Daniel chapter 6. I'd appreciate your prayers for the junior churches today. The buses were quite full, and we're expecting quite a few visitors today. We actually had to split junior churches about 3 or 4 weeks ago just due to the sheer number of kids that have been in there. Between the two, we've averaged somewhere between 70 and 75 kids every Sunday, and we're expecting quite a few more than that today. So pray we don't go crazy sometime in the middle of service this morning. If an entire herd of children come up here screaming, I'm dead, okay? So please mourn me greatly. All right? Daniel chapter 6. We got about halfway through this chapter last week. We're going to do a little bit of recap here. Okay, verses 1 and 2. Daniel's put in position of rulership. And we saw very quickly off here in verse 2. There's 3 presidents of whom Daniel was first. So he's basically second only to the king, a position similar to what Joseph would have had in Egypt. Okay, so he's a very high-ranking official. And he obviously had ticked off a few people. Verses 3 through 5, we see that he was preferred above all the presidents and princes. So there is already a jealousy issue because he's the best. But the Bible gives us evidence of why, verse 3 here, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the Bible actually gives us a little more thought into the king's idea here, is the king thought to set him over the whole realm. The king actually almost invented a brand new position directly for Daniel to put him above these 3 presidents. Daniel was an excellent human being, okay? He was a good man. He had the power of God. He knew he had a relationship with God that was so good, it leaked out into his everyday life to the point where he was getting promoted to top level, okay? What the king actually wanted to do here is legitimately exactly what Pharaoh wanted to do with Joseph. You run everything and just tell me if it's okay. You realize that's what Pharaoh did with Joseph. He just said, here, you do it. He took a guy out of jail and said, here, run everything for me. That's awesome. By the way, the only person that can set that up is God in the first place. And that's what God did here. And by the way, it was Daniel's relationship with God that got him there in the first place. You and I not having a good relationship with God, we're never going to get promoted in life. It doesn't matter what we're doing. Because God's the one that gives the increase. I believe that's also a Bible verse. Okay, let's move on here. You're all like staring at me here, weird. Verse 6. Okay, we're going to go ahead and read verse 6 here. Then these presidents and princes, how many of those people were there total? Do you remember from last week? 120. Wow, we had one person paying attention to anything last week, and it's not real hard considering all you had to do was read the first couple verses of this chapter. Okay, all right. These presidents and princes, 120 of them, actually 119, because we're minus Daniel here, assembled together to the king and thus said unto him, King Darius, live forever. So they decide, these guys go to the king and try to get him to set up a law. We talked about this last week, a royal statute that no one's allowed to ask anything of any god or any man for 30 days except the king. This went down to not just praying prayers, but legitimately asking for help. Could you imagine for 30 days you call 911, hi, is the king available? You call 911, hi, I need to speak to President Trump right now. Why? I got shot. He's busy. I'm gonna die, sorry. That's basically what this law would have done. It's an idiotic law. There's no way around that. This is a legitimately stupid law. Considering this man's kingdom covered an area about the size of the continental United States. And texting wasn't a thing yet. You couldn't immediately get a hold of the king. Hey, I need help. Why? My cat's in a tree. Could you imagine anything? You need a teaspoon of baking soda for something you're working on for Thanksgiving. You got to go ask the king for it. What? Really dumb law. But by the way, it played up to the king's pride. Think about it. The king in this particular culture and in most ancient cultures, the king was held at a low level of deity. So he's already worshipped on some level or another. And all of a sudden he is the God for his entire kingdom. Even if it's just for 30 days, human pride is, whoa. I'm awesome. I don't care who you are. That's oddly intriguing. You have to at least admit that's oddly intriguing. They played to this man's pride and it won. Okay? Verse 10. Daniel knew the writing was signed. Read it with me. And he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. So Daniel didn't stop doing what he'd been doing, because that last phrase, as he did aforetime, Daniel's been doing this. Based on the way this is written, he's probably been doing something similar to this since he was led captive. And this would have been, by the way, about a decade or so after he's been taken captive. Based on the timeline, the chronology of this book, Daniel's a grown man at this point, okay? And he's still doing what he's been doing since he was more than likely a teenager. And, again, we looked at this last week, the idea of facing Jerusalem when we pray. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 6. We looked at it last week. We're going to look at one more time real quick. 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 34. This is Solomon. He was praying at the dedication of the temple. You remember that David was not allowed to build the temple. God had said that there was too much blood on his hands. Okay? So he was not allowed to build the temple, but he made a bunch of preparations for it. By the time Solomon came, it came time for Solomon to actually build the temple. Almost all the building supplies were there. All the gold was in the storehouse. Solomon basically stepped in to the most peaceful time in all of Israel's history. If you look throughout the books of the Bible where Solomon is king, there are no major wars. It's the only time in Israel's history there were no major battles, was during Solomon's reign. That's because David set things up in place for him. David couldn't build the temple, but he prepared for the next generation in such a way that God was able to do some amazingly mighty things. By the way, that should be what we should all strive for with our kids, our grandkids, is we're setting things up spiritually so that the next generation just has to step right into the presence of God. But look at 2 Chronicles 6:34. This is Solomon's prayer. It says, if thy people go out to war against their enemies by the way that thou shalt send them, and they pray unto thee toward this city which thou hast chosen, and the house which I have built for thy name. So he's praying to the Lord, and he's actually basically stating when your people are out to war, when they're away from home, when they're out on the battlefield, we're going to have them face this city because you chose this city. You chose it to be the seat of your holiness. You realize at this time period, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the Shekinah glory, God himself physically sat there. So they were facing where they knew God was. So Daniel was following a precedent that at this point was almost 1,000 years old. Okay, when you're away from home, you face Jerusalem because that's where we know God is. Now, at this point in Daniel's life, in Daniel chapter 6, was the Ark of the Covenant still in Jerusalem? Feedback here. Sunday school, answer questions. Was the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem at this point? No. Nebuchadnezzar had carried away all the treasures out of Jerusalem, including most of the stuff that was in the temple. The only thing that we know of that he never carried away was the Ark of the Covenant, but nobody knew where it was. Nobody. Daniel didn't have a clue. As smart, as wise, as amazing as Daniel was, he didn't know where it was. Now, we all know Indiana Jones knows where it is, and it's buried, and the U.S. government owns it, if you believe fictitious movies. And it also supposedly melts Nazis, which is very odd. Okay, but we're going to jump into verse 11. This is right around where we left off last week. Verse 11. So Daniel's doing exactly what he's been doing since probably he was a teenager. He's facing Jerusalem. Okay, he's praying 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. He's praying here. Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Again, we mentioned this last week. These guys went full stalker. Because it says, then these men. How many of them were there? About 120, 119 to be exact. There's no indication this number's gotten smaller. This is a very large group of stalkers, which either Daniel was really oblivious to the fact that there's 120 people sitting there watching him, or he didn't care because he was going to do what was right no matter what. Where do you hide 119 creepy stalkers at the same time? You ever think about that? That's weird. We used to live over behind Oakdale, and this was back in the late 90s, early 2000s when the boy bands were big, In Sync and all those, there'd be thousands of girls lined up at Oakdale just to like look at one of these guys. Thousands of them. I used to work at the Meriden Mall, and one of these boy bands came in, and it was estimated there were over 8,000 junior high age girls in the Meriden Mall. Meriden Mall's sketchy to begin with. You fill it with that, and it's like, ha ha ha, it's terrible. That boy band ended up actually coming in and out to get to the stage through the store that I worked in. I got to meet them. Oh, I didn't care. Their jeans were way too tight. I'm not sure how they were walking in those things. It was like saran wrap on your legs. It was just, ugh. Where do you can't hide 8,000 teenage girls. Trust me, you can't hide them. I couldn't hide me from 8,000 teenage girls, even though I desperately wanted to quit that day. Where do you hide nearly 120 grown men stalking this dude to find out if he's praying? You ever think about that? Like, how did this work? Daniel's not in some 20-story high-rise, and they're watching him with binoculars. They didn't exist yet. Telescope didn't even exist yet. That means they couldn't have been that far away if they're watching all this. I read the Bible very literally. It's a literal book. God wrote it. That means it's true. So I read it literally. This is weird. A bunch of grown men stalking another grown man. Okay, awkward silence done. Verse 12 and 13. You're not paying attention, so we're going to do some weird things until you do. All right. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? So after this, they run over to the king and they go, hey, Mr. King, didn't you sign a law that nobody's allowed to pray or ask anything except if they ask you? And if they do, they get thrown into the den of lions? What's the king's immediate response? Duh, you were there. You're the ones that brought it to me. I just signed it. So the king answered, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. And here we get a little bit of a clue into the culture. The Bible had talked about Daniel. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had a weird dream where he saw a statue of multiple different makes. It was made out of gold and then silver and then progressed downwards. This is one of those levels of the statue, okay? This one was below where the Babylonian government had been, and it was inferior. Nebuchadnezzar was allowed to make and change laws as he pleased. He was king. He was an absolute monarch. Under the Medo-Persian Empire, if a law was made, it did not change, which could be a huge detriment even to the king himself. But he wasn't allowed to change it. Now, he could write a new law that skirted around it. They were the king of loopholes. We actually get the basis of a lot of idiotic bureaucracy in our government today from the Medo-Persian Empire, because they would set a law and then they would loophole it. Pay attention to our government. They love loopholes. They are the king of loopholes. There is no law passed that doesn't have a huge number of loopholes in it, okay? So this one here, though, at the immediate time, these 30 days, there are no loopholes. You pray to the king, or you get eaten by lions. Verse 13, then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, that guy over there, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, and we paused here for just a moment last week, you realize at this point they're making a very racist comment. Everybody knew he was different. He would have looked different. He would have been dressed different because he was a slave, which bothered them because a slave had a higher position than they did. Okay, let's keep moving. He regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. So that now they're turning Daniel in. Verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. The king at this point, we talked about this last week, this is right near where we left off. Verse 14, the king finally realized he'd been set up. This had been a trap the entire time. And he spends, by the way, according to, again, this is listed here, Medo-Persian Empire, if a law was broken, you had until the going down of the sun to prove your innocence of that day. That was it. After that, you were sentenced, you were tried, and if it was death, you were usually killed on the spot. The king spent the whole day trying to figure out a way to save Daniel. The whole day. Which meant the king cared for Daniel. If the king was going to put Daniel in a place that literally handed over the keys to the kingdom, Daniel meant a lot to him. And my favorite part of this, it's discouraging, but was sore displeased with himself. Can you imagine what the king felt at this moment? He realized he let his pride destroy one of the people he probably trusted the most. If he was going to give Daniel the kingdom, Daniel was probably his most trusted confidant, and he let his pride kill this guy. Because you realize at this point in the king's mind, verse 14, Daniel's dead. Daniel's dead. He let his pride kill one of his friends. Daniel 2:39. Daniel 2:39. Let's pause for just a second on this. Go to Daniel chapter 2. Look at verse 39. This is that idea. This is during the Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar his dream. Daniel 2:39 says, after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the whole earth. This was the idea here. Again, I've mentioned this before. I wanted you to see the verses that tied in with this. Nebuchadnezzar had that dream. Remember, he couldn't remember what the dream was. He said all of his magicians, his astrologers, all of his wise men, if you will, you tell me what the dream was and then tell me what it meant, which legitimately, that's impossible. Okay, that'd be like walking into your psychiatrist and saying, I have a problem. What is it? I don't know. Tell me. And then tell me how to fix it. Aha, it's your mom's fault. That's all they'll tell you. Okay, I just thought I'd share that. Daniel, he's got God on his side. And God gave him the dream. Could you just take a second and think about what Daniel states to Nebuchadnezzar? Oh yeah, I could figure that out for you. When's the last time you thought, you know what? I'm going to have God tell me how to fix Diana Stewart's problems. And then he does. There's a lot of them. You don't have any. All right, nice. Okay. But that's legitimately, Daniel's like, oh yeah. God will tell me all about your crazy one-time dream here, and then I'll tell you what it means. Could you imagine having a relationship with God where you can expect things like that from God? That's amazing. And that inferior, the kingdom was legitimately, God actually said, inferior to thee. The ability to not change laws that don't make sense would be an inferior government, correct? Okay, moving on here. Now, verse 15, go back to Daniel chapter 6, verse 15. We're going to try to finish this chapter here in the next few minutes. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, now, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. So they're reminding him, oh yeah, but by the way, Mr. King, you can't change this. You know that, right? These guys all need slapped. Every single one of them, repeatedly, okay? They need slapped with something hard and covered in spikes, okay? All right, verse 16, then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. This isn't Daniel talking. The king's talking. Daniel had such a good testimony that Darius the king is, your God's going to take care of you. I know it. And by the way, look at it. Thy God, capital G. Who's the only God they're allowed to pray to during this month? The king. The king is the only God, the only person they're allowed to pray to or ask supplication of. And he looks at Daniel and says, your God's got this, because I can't help you. That's a pretty powerful testimony Daniel's got. The king can't change his own law, and he just broke his own law. He didn't make supplication, but he gave credit to the fact that there's someone way more powerful than he was. I find that verse quite amazing. Verse 17. So Daniel's been thrown into this den. A lot of these dens, we think of, there's multiple variations to what a lion's den could have been. Some think it was more like a cave. I have a big issue with it being a cave, because it's not until verse 17 that they bring a stone to cover it. How do you keep the lions in the cave if there's no door? So that means all the guards throwing the lions in, they're dead. Now they're not hungry. That would have made Daniel okay. There is actually a group of people that believe that's what happened and that's why Daniel was safe. No, that's a load of garbage. More than likely, this was some type of a pit. Okay, it could have been an old well, a cistern. There's any number of possibilities. The well or the cistern probably actually make the most sense because there would have been access to at least some water to keep these things alive. Okay, every animal on earth needs access to water or they'll die. Whether they eat or not, they need access to some water. Okay, so a well or cistern makes sense. Plus, almost all of those had a stone covering, which is what we see here in verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. It would have been laid on top, laid upon, so we're looking down. A lot of times what would happen with these, they would catch these lions and literally throw them down into this well after being in a cage or something like that. These things were usually kept at just a step ahead of starvation. They were constantly in a state of hunger on purpose, so that these things were actually kind of going out of their mind with hunger. Whole group of them, usually they were set to a point where they were almost hungry enough to eat each other. So when they throw somebody down there, they didn't last long. There is some documentation left behind from both the Babylonians and the Medo-Persian empires. A lot of what we know of them came from Alexander the Great's conquest of these groups, to where they actually saw some of these pits of lions. They weren't used much past the Medo-Persian Empire going into the Greeks. The Romans used lions to kill people in the Colosseums, but the actual, if you will, pit of lions was not commonly used past this empire. And Alexander the Great wrote extensively on how these work, to where at least one victim he watched, he threw one in to see what would happen. He was a student, he was a learner, and he wanted to see how this worked. According to him and the scribe that wrote this down, they said the man was ripped to shreds before he hit the ground. Daniel gets thrown in here, and then they lock the door with a rock, a giant one, okay? And the king sealed it with his own signet. They literally put some wax on there, and he sealed it. That meant no one could open it until the king said so. And with the signet of his lords, all these 119 punks put their mark on there. You realize the kind of pride they feel at this moment? We got this guy. He's dead. He's dead. He's gone. We fixed it. We did it. I bet you a nickel they had a party after this. Think about it. They just got rid of the guy they considered public enemy number one. He's gone. Wouldn't you be partying? I'm just being honest, that's probably what happened here. That the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Verse 18, then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. So he refused to eat, he refused to let anyone try to comfort him, and he just stayed up the entire night worrying about Daniel. Which gives you a little more indication to how much he probably cared for this man. Okay, moving on then, verse 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. Because here's the deal. If you were punished in any way like this, they would immediately check first thing in the morning. Again, you had until the sun went down to prove your innocence, at which time you were either killed or convicted, in this case thrown into the den of lions. But you had until first light. If for any reason you lived, you were now set free. That was part of their law. By the way, that was actually law here in the United States for quite some time. If you were supposed to be put to death by hanging and it didn't work, you were officially free. One particular gentleman in Louisiana was convicted of a murder, hung, the rope snapped, he got some bruising, he was set free. 3 years later, he committed another murder. They went to hang him, and the rope was made with hemp that was too new, and the noose slipped off, and he fell off the gallows, broke his leg, and he was set free. Lived the rest of his life, actually became a preacher. Lived the rest of his life actually real clean, but they tried to kill him twice. They say it's the only time it's ever happened in the United States that a man was capital punishment failed twice on the same dude. That's pretty impressive. He's a pretty terrible human being that they had to do that twice, but lucky him, I guess. All right. He runs in haste to the den of lions. Verse 20. When he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? The king shows up, and he's, Daniel. And here's what I love. Look at just the first chunk of this. Servant of the living God. he recognized very clearly who God is here. There's a lot of people that give some evidence that King Darius might have gotten saved overnight. Because this is the first time. He already recognized him. He says, thy God, that's your God. Now he calls him servant of the living God. That's a different title altogether. That shows a little bit more of a personal relationship. Is thy God, whom thou servest continually. That's Daniel's character right there, his Christian character. Whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions. He had probably, you realize Darius was not the king. We're going to look into this story coming up next. The 3 Hebrew children in the burning fiery furnace, that wasn't Darius. He'd probably heard about it though. You realize he took over a kingdom. When you throw 3 men in a furnace and they walk around, word gets around. He'd probably heard about this. This guy recognizes that the God of these Hebrews is very powerful. Go to Jeremiah chapter 32. Jeremiah chapter 32. Jeremiah 32:27. You may know this verse. You may not have known where it came from, but you may know this verse. Jeremiah 32:27 says, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me? Darius didn't know this. He didn't know this verse. Daniel probably didn't even know this verse. Because Jeremiah wrote this during the captivity. Remember, Jeremiah would have been back in Israel. He didn't know Daniel. Is anything too hard for me? Romans chapter 4. We're going to bounce in our Bible just a little bit. Romans chapter 4. We're going to look at a couple of verses here real quickly. New Testament, Romans chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. Romans 4, I'm going to go ahead and start. Romans 4, 20 and 21. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able to perform. God can do anything, and he can't fail. He's God. He literally lacks the ability to fail. Could you imagine that? Literally, he can't. God can't fail. Anything God decides to do, it's already done. And it's right. Always. Go to Ephesians chapter 3. Last one here on this section. We're going to jump back to Daniel. Ephesians chapter 3, look at verse 20. Ephesians 3:20 says, now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. God isn't just going to do what we ask. He's going to do what he wants, and it's going to be way bigger and way better than we ever thought. Because there's nothing too hard for God. So Darius is asking, was God able to deliver thee? Go back to Daniel chapter 6, and let's see his answer. Daniel chapter 6, verse 21, then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. So Daniel's still using proper terminology. This is the king that signed a prideful law that got Daniel thrown into this den of lions, and he still has respect. Could you imagine if that existed in our country today? Even when we disagree, there's still some respect. Change some things. Verse 22, my God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. And here we get evidence as to what happened. It says, my God has sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths. We don't know what this looked like, because the only person that wrote about it was Daniel, and he only gave us about half a sentence on it. But apparently Daniel saw an angel that night, and the angel just came down and pinched those lions' mouths shut. Sorry. Could you imagine what that would have looked like? You ever had to hold your kid's mouth shut for any reason? Like you're trying to give medicine, they keep spitting it out, or you're trying to get them to eat, and you're like, no. We do that with Molly. We're not terrible parents. We are slightly cruel occasionally. The girl won't eat. She weighs 9 pounds, and she's 3.5. She's so stinking tiny, but she sometimes won't eat. So I just hold her little. You can only move your lower jaw anyways, so I just hold it shut. Swallow. God sent an angel and held lions' mouths shut. Lions have one of the top 5 strongest bites of any animal in the world. And this guy just no, kitty cat, you're not doing that tonight. Could you imagine what that would look like? And there's teeth baring on both sides. And I'm not sure if Daniel's chuckling to himself. I'm not sure if he's freaking out because there's an angel there holding mouth shut. I don't know what happened. But Daniel spent the night completely safe. Verse 23. Verse 23. Actually, you know what? Before we go there, go to Hebrews chapter 1. We're going to bounce back and forth in the New Testament just a little bit here. Keep your finger in Hebrews. We're going to be back there one more time here in just a second. But Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1, it's near the end of the Bible, verses 13 and 14. But to which of the angels he said at any time, sit on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool? Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation? God's got this whole army of angels he can send to help at any given time. Amen. All we've got to do is have the right relationship with God where he actually wants to maybe help us, take care of us. He promised he would either way. But aren't you more prone to help people that are moderately nice to you? If some guy tries to shoot at you, are you going to help change his tire? No. Same concept goes with our relationship with God. If we ignore him repeatedly, disobey everything his word says, hey, God, I need some help. He loves us enough. He's probably going to help either way. Amen. May not be what it should have been because our relationship wasn't there. Go back to Daniel chapter 6, verse 23. Then was the king exceeding glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. This is where we get a little more evidence that, again, this was more likely some type of a pit, a well, a cistern, because you don't pull someone up out of a cave typically. Caves go back and then go down. So he's pulling him up and out. So maybe they played the claw game. I'm not sure. My grandma's amazing at the claw game. Like literally, she can win every time she puts a quarter in those stupid machines. How many of you waste like probably hundreds of dollars when you were a kid at those stupid claw games at the fair? My grandma wins every time. I don't know how she does it. It's absolutely amazing. We got a box one day when Paisley and Callie were like 2 or 3. My grandma had gone to a fair and won like 16 animals with the claw game and sent them to Paisley and Callie. I'm like, she's like, yeah, I had $5 in my pocket. I don't know how you do that. She's amazing. She's cool. All right. So they pull him out. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him because he believed in his God. There's not a scratch on this dude. He spent the night hanging out with lions, and there's not a scratch on him. I mean, this is like a YouTube video waiting to happen here. Do you ever see the video of the guy finds there's two men back in the 70s in London, Harrods of London. Anybody ever heard of that? It's a department store, kind of a high-end version of like a Macy's. Harrods of London in the early 70s, you could buy exotic pets, like a lion. These two guys in like 1972 bought a pet lion from a department store in downtown London. Times have changed drastically. Okay? They owned this thing for about 4 years in an apartment. It got too big, so they decided to release it back into the wild. They took it down. They flew down to Africa, took it to one of the national parks there, and released this thing back into the wild. Well, about 5 years later, they flew back down. They wanted to see the lion again, and they brought a film crew with them because people had heard about this story. They saw the lion, and everybody got kind of freaked out because this lion it's a male lion, started charging them. At this point, he's full grown. He's about 500 pounds, starts charging and jumps up and wraps its paws around the guy's head and starts licking his face. It remembered who he was. It's amazing. You can find the video on YouTube. If you're into animals, you might cry. I thought it was cool. I didn't cry. I don't like cats that much. Big ones are not, unless they're cooked with teriyaki sauce, and then they're delicious. So, all right. Daniel spends the night hanging out with a bunch of lions and not a scratch on him. Some of you are cat owners and couldn't say hi to your cat this morning without getting a scratch. He spent the night with lions. And it's all because of the last part of verse 23, because he believed in his God. Go back to Hebrews. I told you keep a finger in there. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, look at verse 33. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Faith is pretty amazing. Faith is sometimes hard. Somebody asked the other day how our family was doing with all the news this week about what's going on with Mom. And I told him, I said, God is always good. We know that and we believe that. Some days it's just harder to show it than others. Sometimes it's hard to prove what your faith is. It really is. I'm not going to hide that. We all understand that. But faith can do some amazing stuff according to Hebrews 11:33. It can do mind-blowing things. Are we showing it? Daniel showed it. He kept doing what was right no matter how hard the enemy fought. And his faith became so real that more than likely a pagan king got saved. Go back to Daniel. We're going to finish this chapter. We're almost done. Daniel chapter 6, verse 24. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. How many men were there again? 119. Plus their kids, plus their wives. And again, we get some more evidence to how vicious these lions break all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. They didn't even hit ground before they got broken. By the way, that's what pride will get you. That's what jealousy will get you. That's what hatred will get you. Somebody gets broken every time. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote unto all the people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Again, this would have been in his kingdom. His kingdom covered a huge portion of the known earth. But in both the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks, they considered their kingdom to be the entirety of earth. If we don't control it, it's not part of our world, basically is what they were stating. So he's writing to everyone here, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever in his kingdom. That which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. The most recent decree that we know of that King Darius has signed was nobody's allowed to pray or ask anything of anybody except for the king for 30 days. And this is the follow-up. God is the God, and everybody's got to recognize that. Now, he did go a little bit off here because he demanded that everyone worship God. God instilled in us a free will. We get to choose whether or not we worship and follow God. King Darius didn't maybe understand that one as well. Still the absolute monarchy, he's the king, and he just told everybody, hey, you all worship God. That's it. That's the only option you've got. Now, first off, that'd be amazing. Come on, that would be cool. If somebody just said, hey, by the way, worshiping God the right way, that's the only religion we're going to allow anymore. That'd be cool. It would be, legitimately. Not exactly the right thing to do. Because again, God gave us a free will. We get to choose. He kind of took that away. But this is where we get a little more evidence that more than likely Darius may have gotten saved here. Verse 28, last verse here. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So this king and the follow-up, Daniel prospered. He continued to grow and to continue to do better and better. We're going to pray and we'll get out of here. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for this book of Daniel. Lord, thank you for all the promises, all the information that we have on how good you are, Lord, and how much you take care of us. Lord, thank you for just the example of faith that Daniel gives us. Lord, please bless this morning's services. I know a lot of work's gone into today, a lot of invitations, a lot of prayer. Lord, we're asking you to do something special, Lord, see souls saved. Give Pastor Bish the wisdom and the words and the strength as he preaches this morning. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You're dismissed. Church starts in about 15 minutes.